Imagine a secluded observatory perched high on a stormy hill where the stars are the only witnesses. Now add a shocking murder, a locked room, and a group of people with dark secrets. In Murder at the Observatory, nothing is as it seems, and every clue leads deeper into a web of betrayal. Settle in. This mystery will twist and turn, keeping you on edge until the final revelation. Beatrice Fenwick had seen many things in her 65 years, but none had quite the allure of this night. The Hillcrest Observatory, perched atop a remote hill and surrounded by dense forest, stood bathed in the silvery glow of the moon. A storm loomed on the horizon, though the air was still for now. As Beatrice stepped onto the gravel path leading up to the observatory, she noticed how the tall, dark trees stretched upwards, their branches seeming to reach for the stars. Beside her, her 15-year-old grandson Arthur practically vibrated with excitement. A budding astronomy enthusiast, he had always been eager to explore the heavens. His enthusiasm was infectious, and tonight, his excitement was particularly palpable. "Grandmother, do you think we'll see something truly amazing tonight?" Arthur asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Beatrice smiled, her mind already drifting to the stories she'd tell him later. "Perhaps," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But the stars have a way of keeping their secrets, Arthur. It's not always what we see, but what we notice that matters." Arthur, full of youthful optimism, beamed. "I'm sure we'll see something incredible tonight. Just wait and see." The observatory buzzed with anticipation. A diverse mix of astronomers, donors, and a few newcomers had gathered in the planetarium, a magnificent room with a glass dome that offered an unobstructed view of the night sky. The stars twinkled above, vast and distant, and for a moment Beatrice marveled at how the space seemed to envelop them, as if the stars were both distant and close, part of something much larger. The guest of honor, Dr. Gregory Marlowe, stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a group of admirers and colleagues. Marlowe was known for his brilliance. His groundbreaking work had earned him accolades, but his arrogance often put people off. His tall, thin figure was easily recognizable, his sharp features set in an expression of perpetual disdain, as if he found little to be of interest unless it suited his intellectual pursuits. Arthur, noticing Beatrice's glance toward the man, leaned in. "That's Dr. Marlowe, right? He's the one who made all those discoveries about star formations, isn't he?" Beatrice nodded, her sharp eyes never leaving Marlowe. "Yes, that's him. Brilliant, but not the easiest man to be around." Before they could speak further, Marlowe turned toward the crowd, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you're all as eager as I am for tonight's session," he said, his tone filled with self-assurance. "But let me assure you, this evening I will reveal something truly extraordinary, something that will change the way we see the universe." A hush fell over the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A groundbreaking discovery. There was tension in the air, the kind of weighty anticipation that seemed to stretch each moment longer than the last. Beatrice observed the guests closely, noting the mixture of excitement and suspicion on their faces. The announcement, though exciting, left an undercurrent of unease in its wake. Beatrice's gaze shifted to the others gathered in the room. There was Professor Edith Langford, standing at the far side with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Langford was a brilliant academic in her own right, but her rivalry with Marlowe had long been public knowledge. She was known for her fierce intellect, but tonight there was something sharper in her gaze, something more bitter, as if she were bracing herself for an announcement she might not want to hear. Then there was Howard Kettering, a wealthy donor with an amateur interest in astronomy. Kettering had made no secret of his disdain for Marlowe, and although he always presented himself as charming and polished, Beatrice had noticed flashes of temper beneath the surface. His presence here seemed more a matter of pride than genuine interest in the stars. Beatrice's eyes briefly met those of Sylvia Marlowe, Dr. Marlowe's much younger wife. Sylvia was a striking woman, but there was an air of nervousness about her, a palpable discomfort that seemed to grow the longer she stood in the shadows of her husband's brilliance. Beatrice couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Sylvia led behind the closed doors of their home. Whispers had followed them for years, rumors of a strained marriage, of control, of unspoken secrets. Beatrice had no proof, but she suspected there was more to Sylvia's quiet demeanor than met the eye. Finally, there was Robert Kane, the observatory's caretaker. A man of few words, Kane was the kind of person who seemed to know everything about a place without ever drawing attention to himself. Beatrice had always found him an enigmatic figure, someone who blended into the background but whose watchful eyes missed nothing. Tonight, his presence seemed even more subdued, as though the storm outside had crept into his mood too. Beatrice took in the gathering, her mind sharp and clear, absorbing the tension that surrounded her. There was something in the air tonight, something that didn't sit quite right. Marlowe's announcement had only heightened the feeling of unease, and Beatrice wondered if any of the others could sense it too. As the evening wore on and the guests filtered into the planetarium, Beatrice could almost feel the weight of the secrets each person carried. Arthur, ever the optimist, nudged her gently. "What do you think, grandmother? Are we going to see something amazing?" Beatrice smiled softly, her gaze still scanning the room. "Perhaps, but remember, Arthur, sometimes the most extraordinary things are hidden in plain sight." The crowd settled into their seats, their eyes trained on the sky above. But Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling that tonight the stars were not the only things with secrets waiting to be revealed. The lights in the planetarium flickered once, then dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the stars outside the glass dome to illuminate the room. A hush fell over the guests, and all eyes turned to the vast expanse above, where the heavens were about to unfold in their full glory. The quiet murmurs of excitement were the only sound, and for a brief moment the world outside seemed a distant memory. Then, without warning, a blood-curdling scream sliced through the silence. It was high-pitched, frantic, filled with terror, and it reverberated off the walls, chilling everyone in the room. The lights snapped back on, and for a split second, confusion reigned, a flurry of movement as guests turned, searching for the source of the scream. Beatrice's heart quickened, but her movements remained steady. Arthur, standing beside her, gripped her arm with a tension that spoke of fear far beyond his years. She gently pried his fingers from her sleeve, and with practiced composure, moved toward the source of the scream. The room was in chaos, but the body was clear. Dr. Gregory Marlowe was slumped in his chair at the planetarium center, his body oddly still. The telescope tripod lay beside him, its base bloodied and ominous. A thick crimson stain spread across the floor, pooling at his feet. His face, usually sharp and confident, was now frozen in an expression of shock, eyes wide and vacant. It was a scene that seemed impossibly unreal, as if time itself had paused in disbelief. The room erupted into chaos. Guests rushed forward, some gasping, others too stunned to move, their hands hovering uncertainly over the body. The air, once filled with awe and wonder, was now thick with tension and disbelief. How could this have happened? The doors had been locked from the inside, and there was no way anyone could have entered or exited unnoticed. Beatrice surveyed the scene, her mind already working, sifting through the chaos. She remained calm as the others panicked. Arthur, wide-eyed and shaken, stood behind her, the questions racing through his young mind faster than he could voice them. "Grandmother, how could this? How could he?" Arthur's voice faltered. Beatrice placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a steadying presence. "Stay close, Arthur," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving the body. "Don't get caught up in the panic. We need to think." She moved toward Dr. Marlowe's body, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, every small piece of evidence. Her sharp mind worked quickly, noting the odd angle of Marlowe's body, the way he had slumped over in his chair, as if the force of whatever had struck him had been sudden. She noticed the telescope tripod beside him, its base soaked in blood, but it had been positioned so carefully that it couldn't be dismissed as an accidental fall. It was almost as if someone had deliberately placed it there, an attempt to mislead, to confuse. A faint scent lingered in the air, something floral, faintly sweet. Cologne, but not the type Dr. Marlowe usually wore. Beatrice's senses were alert, absorbing everything. This was not just a murder, it was a message. But who was the message for, and who had sent it? She stepped back, allowing the others to inspect the body, but she held herself apart, a quiet observer in the midst of the storm. The guests were beginning to argue, their voices rising in a cacophony of confusion and panic. Some were already insisting that they should call the authorities, but Beatrice knew it would be some time before help arrived. The storm outside was worsening, and the remote location of the observatory meant the nearest police station was miles away. In the meantime, they were left with no choice but to deal with the situation themselves. "Beatrice, what should we do?" Arthur asked, his voice tremulous but laced with the desire to understand, to help. Beatrice looked down at her grandson, her expression soft but firm. "We do what we always do, Arthur. We observe and we wait. We'll find out who did this and why." As the others continued to argue, some calling for the police, others whispering nervously amongst themselves, Beatrice's gaze remained fixed on Dr. Marlowe's body. She could almost feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing in on her. Who would have wanted to kill Dr. Marlowe? And how had they managed to do so in a locked room with no one entering or leaving? Every question posed a new puzzle, and every piece of the scene seemed to provide more mystery than clarity. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Beatrice turned to see the observatory caretaker, Robert Kane, standing in the doorway. His face was impassive, though there was a tightness to his jaw that spoke of the unease he must have felt. He made no move to approach the body, but instead his eyes met Beatrice's with a silent understanding, as if he, too, knew that things were about to spiral out of control. Beatrice's mind was already turning. There were clues here, small but significant, and she would gather them, piece them together, and in time, she would uncover the truth. But for now, she allowed the others to argue, to panic. They were playing their part in the drama that had already begun to unfold. She, however, was focused, calm, observant, and ready for whatever came next. The storm outside howled louder, the wind pressing against the observatory windows, but inside, the tension was palpable. There was a murderer in the room with them, and Beatrice would not rest until she uncovered the truth. Beatrice moved slowly around the room, her sharp eyes scanning the guests who had gathered in tight knots, murmuring amongst themselves. The shock of Marlowe's murder still hung thick in the air, but the initial panic was beginning to subside. The guests, though anxious, were starting to question one another, their glances darting nervously. It was clear to Beatrice that they were trying to piece together the puzzle, each one suspecting the other. She could almost hear their thoughts swirling, like whispers in the air, their uncertainty palpable. Arthur stood beside her, his youthful face tight with concentration. "What should we do now, grandmother?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Beatrice's gaze swept across the room, taking in each person's face, their body language, the way they interacted with each other. She could sense the hidden motives beneath their polished exteriors. Some were more skilled at masking their emotions than others, but Beatrice could see through it. It was time to begin asking questions, the quiet investigation that would ultimately expose the truth. "Let's start with the others," Beatrice said softly. "We need to find out who had a reason to kill him, and what those reasons might be." She moved toward the group of guests who had gathered in the corner of the room, huddled together as if their unity might offer protection from the suspicion now surrounding them. The first person Beatrice approached was Edith Langford. Edith stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though she were considering an escape, though she knew it was impossible. The rivalry between Edith and Marlowe was well known, and the animosity between them had only grown in recent years. "Professor Langford," Beatrice began, her tone soft but probing, "I understand you and Dr. Marlowe had quite a history." Edith's sharp eyes flickered with a flash of irritation before she quickly composed herself. "History?" she repeated, her voice cool. "Marlowe stole my work. He presented it as his own. His entire career is built on taking from others." Beatrice nodded slowly, taking in Edith's words. "And that gave you reason to hate him?" "Not hate," Edith replied quickly. "I don't waste energy on hate, but I will not pretend that I was pleased with his actions. It's not just about the work. It's about respect, and he had none for me." Beatrice studied Edith carefully, wondering if the professor's anger had been enough to drive her to murder. But for now, Beatrice made no judgments. She simply moved on. Next, Beatrice turned her attention to Howard Kettering, who was standing slightly apart from the others. He had a tight grip on his drink, his face flushed with emotion. When he noticed Beatrice approaching, he quickly straightened, though his shoulders remained stiff. There was an edge to his demeanor, something simmering just beneath the surface. "Mr. Kettering," Beatrice began, "I understand you had some financial dealings with Dr. Marlowe. How would you describe your relationship with him?" Kettering's eyes narrowed, and he set his glass down with deliberate care. "I didn't know him well, if that's what you mean. He was a brilliant man, but a difficult one. We had a business arrangement, some investments, a few contributions to the observatory, but Marlowe was always the one in control, always making the decisions without consulting anyone else." Beatrice watched him carefully. His voice didn't shake, but there was something about his words that seemed a little too rehearsed. "Were you ever unhappy with how those investments went?" Kettering stiffened, a flash of anger crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "He took advantage of me, of course, but I didn't kill him for it." "Of course," Beatrice replied, her tone gentle but unconvinced, "but it's clear that Marlowe's actions didn't sit well with you." Kettering's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Beatrice turned away from him, her mind already working. As she moved across the room, she spotted Sylvia Marlowe, her expression pale, her hands trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the hem of her dress. Beatrice had noticed her earlier, the way she seemed to shrink into the shadows whenever her husband had been near. There had been a tension in the air between them, something unspoken yet palpable. Beatrice approached her quietly. "Sylvia," Beatrice began, her voice low, "I know this must be difficult for you, but I need to ask you, what was your relationship with your husband like? Was there conflict?" Sylvia's eyes flickered nervously. She glanced at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice quivering slightly. Beatrice's eyes softened, but she pressed on. "It's clear that your marriage was strained. Was there something that caused that? Something that might have been a reason for Dr. Marlowe's death?" Sylvia shook her head, her lips trembling. "I didn't kill him. You have to believe me. We had problems, yes. But—" She trailed off, her voice choking in her throat. Beatrice studied her carefully. There was something about Sylvia's reaction that didn't quite add up. Was she hiding something more than just marital tension? Beatrice turned her attention next to Robert Kane, the observatory's caretaker. He had been standing off to the side, his face unreadable. His presence was unsettling in its quietness. Kane was the kind of man who blended into the background, never seeking attention but always watching. "Mr. Kane," Beatrice began, "I know you are familiar with the inner workings of the observatory. You must have seen Dr. Marlowe around quite often." Kane nodded, his expression impassive. "I've worked here for years. Dr. Marlowe often came to check on things, though he didn't like to be bothered. He preferred to keep to himself." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "And did you ever notice anything unusual about his behavior? Anything that might suggest someone had a reason to harm him?" Kane's eyes flickered slightly, but he remained silent for a moment. "I didn't see anything unusual," he said slowly. "But people here, they all have their secrets. Everyone is hiding something. You'd be surprised what I know." Beatrice studied him closely, trying to read his expression. Was he hinting at something more, or was he simply playing his cards carefully as he always did? As the questioning continued, Beatrice's mind began to piece together a puzzle, a series of clues and suspicions that would eventually lead her to the truth. The lipstick smudge on the telescope handle, the hidden compartment that contained blackmail letters. Each of these pieces seemed to tell a story of their own, and it was clear that Marlowe had not just been a brilliant scientist, he had been a man who had made dangerous enemies. The tension in the room was palpable as the guests eyed one another warily, each wondering if the person standing next to them could be the killer. Beatrice knew that the answers were hidden somewhere in these carefully guarded secrets, and with each passing moment, the truth drew ever closer. The atmosphere in the observatory had shifted. What had once been a place of scholarly intrigue and excitement now felt thick with suspicion. The guests, though outwardly composed, wore their discomfort like an open wound, glancing at each other nervously as though expecting someone to reveal their guilt. Beatrice, ever perceptive, watched it all, each subtle movement, every nervous gesture. There was something deeply wrong here, and it was her task to unravel it. Arthur, beside her, was no longer the wide-eyed child he had been hours ago. The weight of the situation seemed to be settling on him as heavily as it did the others. Still, there was a spark in his eyes, a hunger for knowledge and discovery that never quite faded. He had come to understand that this evening was no longer about stargazing, it was about something far darker. Beatrice turned her attention to the gathered guests. It was time to dig deeper, to start peeling away the layers of their stories. Each one of them had an alibi, but as she examined them more closely, inconsistencies began to surface, small cracks in their defenses that no one else seemed to notice. She approached Howard Kettering first. He had been speaking with a small group of people near the telescope during the chaos, but his alibi didn't hold up. He had claimed to be observing a distant constellation, his eyes trained on the sky as Marlowe's death unfolded. However, one of the other guests had seen him standing near the back of the room at the time of the murder. This detail was small, but it raised questions. "Mr. Kettering," Beatrice said, her voice calm but firm, "you mentioned you were observing a constellation when Dr. Marlowe was killed. Could you tell me which constellation it was?" Kettering stiffened, his eyes flicking nervously toward the other guests. I don't remember exactly," he stammered. "It's been a while since I've had the chance to observe." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "That's unusual for someone with your level of expertise, don't you think?" Kettering looked away, his fingers gripping his glass so tightly his knuckles went white. I suppose I lost track of time. The stars can do that to you." Beatrice nodded slowly, not satisfied with the response, but deciding not to press him further for now. There were other guests to speak with, and her instincts told her that Kettering was hiding more than just a questionable alibi. Meanwhile, Arthur had been exploring the observatory on his own. His curiosity was insatiable, and though Beatrice had cautioned him to stay close, she knew he was quick to pick up on things she herself might miss. It was while wandering through Marlowe's private office that Arthur made a discovery. He had been poking around the shelves, looking at old maps and astronomical charts, when something caught his eye, a small vial unlabeled and tucked away behind a stack of books. He held the vial up to the light, inspecting it closely. It contained a clear liquid, faintly tinted with a greenish hue. There was no label, no indication of what it might be, but Arthur's mind immediately leapt to the possibility. Could it be poison? Or perhaps some other substance? He slipped the vial into his pocket, deciding he would show it to Beatrice when the time was right. Later, while walking back to the main room, Arthur overheard something that made him pause. It was Sylvia Marlowe and Edith Langford speaking in hushed tones near the back of the observatory. At first, he couldn't make out the words, but as he drew closer, he caught snippets of the conversation. "I told you we couldn't keep doing this," Sylvia whispered, her voice shaky. "The letters—" "I told you not to worry about them," Edith snapped. "No one knows about the letters. We can control this, as long as we keep our stories straight." Arthur's curiosity piqued. He stepped back quietly, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. The mention of the letters was significant. He had overheard the word before, and now it seemed to be at the center of the conversation between the two women. What were these letters, and how were they tied to Marlowe's murder? He had to tell Beatrice. As Arthur returned to Beatrice's side, he made a mental note to share what he had overheard. The letters seemed to be a key part of the mystery, and the way Edith and Sylvia spoke about them made it clear they were both involved in something far more complicated than they had let on. Beatrice, meanwhile, had been inspecting the telescope tripod, the very same piece of equipment that had been used as the murder weapon. She crouched beside it, her fingers tracing the smooth metal of the tripod's legs. Her sharp eyes caught something unusual, the way it had been placed next to Marlowe's body. The position seemed too deliberate. If the tripod had been dropped or fallen by accident, it would have landed at a different angle, not so neatly positioned. The scene had been staged. Someone had carefully placed the tripod by the body to mislead the investigators, to create the illusion of a crime of passion or a sudden fit of rage. But Beatrice knew better. The murder had been methodical, planned. Whoever had done this wanted it to look chaotic, but the careful placement of the tripod revealed otherwise. It was a calculated move, designed to confuse, to throw off anyone who might come looking for answers. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many questions. Who was blackmailing whom? What did these mysterious letters contain? And most pressing of all, who had the most to gain from Marlowe's death? Beatrice rose from her crouch, her mind working at a rapid pace. It was time to dig deeper, to press harder. The truth was out there, and Beatrice would find it, one piece at a time. The night had grown heavier, the storm outside intensifying, its winds rattling the observatory windows. Inside, the tension was thick, heavier than the rain beating against the glass. Beatrice had never been one to shy away from difficult truths, and tonight she was beginning to uncover them one by one. The atmosphere in the observatory had shifted from unsettling to downright dangerous. Someone here wanted the investigation to stop, and Beatrice was determined not to let that happen. Beatrice's suspicions had been building ever since she overheard the hushed conversation between Sylvia and Edith. The mention of the letters had piqued her interest. But what Arthur had discovered next turned her investigation in a completely new direction. It was time to turn her focus back to Sylvia, to uncover the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of her fragile demeanor. Sylvia Marlowe had been quick to deny any connection to the events that had unfolded, but Beatrice knew there was more to the woman's story than met the eye. As she spent more time observing Sylvia's movements, she began to notice things that weren't adding up. Sylvia was too anxious, too jittery. Her every glance seemed to dart away from those she spoke to, as though she were hiding something, a secret just beyond the reach of her words. It was in the dimly lit hallway of the observatory that Beatrice found the piece of the puzzle she had been looking for. As she moved quietly through the space, she noticed the slight sound of whispers drifting through a half-open door. Without hesitation, Beatrice stepped closer, listening carefully. There, in the shadows of the observatory's staff quarters, Sylvia and Robert Kane stood close together, speaking in low tones. The secrecy in their voices was unmistakable. "You don't understand," Sylvia whispered, her voice shaking. "If anyone finds out about us, everything will be ruined. I can't live with the shame." "Shh!" Robert's voice was calm, almost too calm. "You need to calm down. No one will find out. We've kept it hidden this long, haven't we?" Beatrice felt a chill spread through her as the truth clicked into place. Sylvia and Robert Kane, the quiet caretaker of the observatory, were having an affair, one that had been carefully concealed from everyone, including Dr. Marlowe. A relationship hidden in the shadows, one that had given Sylvia the motive she needed to want her husband gone. It was clear now the control Marlowe had exerted over her, combined with the affair, had created the perfect storm of resentment. Sylvia had her reasons for wanting him dead, and those reasons were rooted deep in the life she had tried so hard to keep hidden. With the discovery of this secret relationship, Beatrice's suspicions were confirmed. Sylvia was desperate to keep the truth from coming out, not just about the affair, but about the ties that had bound her to Robert Kane. It was no longer just about a woman trapped in a controlling marriage. It was about a woman who had everything to lose. But Sylvia's involvement was only part of the mystery. As Beatrice delved deeper, it became clear that Dr. Marlowe had been a far more dangerous man than he appeared. He had been blackmailing several of the attendees, using the letters he had kept hidden in his desk to exploit their weaknesses. The letters discovered by Arthur had revealed a trail of secrets, secrets that some were desperate to keep buried. Edith Langford, it seemed, was one of those who had fallen victim to Marlowe's manipulation. The letters indicated that Marlowe had threatened to expose her past research theft, an act that would have destroyed her career. Edith had always been bitter about Marlowe's success, but now it was clear that bitterness had turned into something much darker: fear and ultimately rage. Howard Kettering was no different. The letters revealed that Marlowe had known about Kettering's failed financial dealings and had used the knowledge to extort money from him. Kettering's anger toward Marlowe, while public, had now taken on a much deeper significance. It was no longer just about pride. It was about survival. Each of these guests had a motive. Each had something to lose. and Marlowe had exploited it, turning his intellect into a weapon that had torn their lives apart. But now, Beatrice saw. The time for silence was over. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in the hearts of those around her. As Beatrice pieced together the motives, she felt the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one more element to uncover, the danger that seemed to be lurking around every corner. It was then that Arthur, who had been wandering the observatory in search of more clues, came running toward her, his face pale. "Grandmother!" he gasped, out of breath. "There's something in the mechanical room." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. The mechanical room was a place no one ventured unless necessary. It housed the observatory's delicate machinery and equipment, the heart of the building's operations. "What happened, Arthur?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady, though she could feel her pulse quicken. "It was an accident," Arthur said, his voice high with panic. "I was near the back of the room looking at the equipment when—" Before he could finish, Beatrice was already moving toward the mechanical room, Arthur close behind. When they reached the door, it was slightly ajar, the room beyond dim and silent. Beatrice stepped inside, her senses on high alert. Arthur's eyes were wide with fear. "There was a pulley system, Grandmother. It was loose, and it almost fell on me. If I hadn't moved—" Beatrice took in the scene. A large, heavy piece of machinery had been positioned precariously, a loose pulley system that could easily have caused injury if it had fallen. It had been no accident. Someone had tried to intimidate them. Someone wanted to keep them away from the truth. The mechanical room, with its dangerous equipment, had been turned into a trap, a warning to back off. Beatrice's mind raced. Who would go so far as to endanger Arthur? She had known the stakes were high, but now it seemed that someone was willing to go to any lengths to stop the investigation. Whoever the killer was, they were getting desperate. She turned to Arthur, her face a mixture of concern and resolve. "We need to be careful, Arthur. Whoever did this is watching us closely now. But we will not stop. We're closer than ever to the truth." The storm outside raged louder, but Beatrice was resolute. The secrets of the observatory were coming to light, and she would not rest until the killer was exposed. The observatory had fallen eerily quiet. Beatrice sat in the center of the planetarium, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her sharp eyes flicking over the gathered guests. She had spent hours piecing together the evidence, connecting the fragments of truth that had slowly been revealed to her. And now she was ready. The pieces of the puzzle were in place, but the timing had to be perfect. She would not reveal her theory until she had gathered final proof that would expose the killer beyond a shadow of a doubt. Her thoughts were steady, her mind clear as she considered the sequence of events. The blackmail letters were central to the murder. Dr. Marlowe had used them to manipulate and control those around him. Edith Langford, Howard Kettering, and Sylvia Marlowe had all been desperate to protect themselves from exposure. But there was one person whose motive had remained the clearest of all, Edith Langford. Edith's rivalry with Marlowe was well known, but it had gone deeper than mere professional jealousy. Marlowe had stolen Edith's research and claimed it as his own, earning accolades and recognition while she was left to watch from the sidelines. The theft had driven Edith to the brink of obsession, but it was the blackmail that had truly pushed her over the edge. Marlowe had held secrets over her head, threatening to expose her past if she didn't comply with his demands. And that, Beatrice realized, was the key to the murder. Edith had planned the murder carefully. She had used poison to incapacitate Marlowe, rendering him vulnerable before striking him with the telescope tripod to stage a crime of passion. The careful placement of the tripod by Marlowe's body, the blood-stained weapon, the way it had all seemed too deliberate, it was all part of Edith's plan to mislead the others into thinking it was a fit of rage. But Edith had made one crucial mistake. She had framed Sylvia Marlowe by using her lipstick, smudging it on the telescope handle to make it appear as though Sylvia had been the last to touch it. She had hoped to divert suspicion away from herself and cast blame on Sylvia, whose own strained relationship with her husband had already made her a target for suspicion. Beatrice's eyes flicked to Edith, who was standing near the back of the room, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously from one person to another. Edith had always been the most guarded of the group, her emotions carefully controlled. But now, Beatrice could see the cracks in her composure, the subtle signs of guilt that Edith had tried so hard to mask. Beatrice had one final move to make. She needed to set a trap to force Edith into revealing her guilt in front of everyone, and she knew exactly how to do it. Beatrice stood in front of the room, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous tension that hung in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had already unraveled the threads of the mystery. "In order to honor Dr. Marlowe's legacy, I believe we should reenact the stargazing session he had planned for this evening. A simple act, a commemoration of sorts, but one that may shed light on the events that led to his tragic death." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. They were all eager for closure, for the truth to come to light, though none of them knew how close they were to it. Beatrice motioned for them to gather in their original positions, just as they had been earlier in the night. As they moved into place, Beatrice took her seat, her eyes scanning the room once more. She had arranged this carefully, making sure that everyone had a part to play, whether they realized it or not. The reenactment would force the killer to reveal themselves. Arthur stood by her side, his face serious. Beatrice had explained to him what she intended to do, and he had watched with rapt attention as the pieces of the mystery fell into place. He could sense the tension building, and though he was still young, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He knew that the truth was almost within their grasp. Beatrice raised a hand, signaling the start of the reenactment. "Let us begin, then. Everyone, take your positions." The guests hesitated for a moment before reluctantly taking their places, just as they had earlier. Beatrice allowed the tension to build, watching them closely. She could feel it, their growing discomfort, their unease as they began to relive the events of the evening. And then it happened. Edith Langford, standing near the back of the room, made a subtle movement, just a shift in posture, a momentary glance toward the telescope where the murder had occurred. Her eyes flicked nervously to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in to end the charade. The pressure was too much. She couldn't keep her composure any longer. Beatrice stood up, her gaze fixed firmly on Edith. "Edith Langford," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You're the one who killed Dr. Marlowe." The room fell silent. The others looked at Beatrice in shock, and then at Edith, whose face drained of color. Edith opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her body stiffened, and she took a small, hesitant step back. Beatrice continued, her voice steady. "It was you who stole his research, who watched him thrive at your expense. It was you who, in your desperation, turned to blackmail to keep your secrets hidden. But it wasn't enough, was it? The humiliation, the years of watching him take what was yours, it drove you to murder." Edith's eyes darted to the others in the room, her hands trembling. "No," she began, but Beatrice cut her off. "You poisoned him, Edith," Beatrice said. "You incapacitated him with poison, rendering him helpless. And then you used the telescope tripod to make it look like a crime of passion. You thought you could frame Sylvia, use her lipstick to throw suspicion on her. But you made one mistake. You underestimated me." Beatrice's gaze hardened. "You killed him because of your need for revenge, and you thought you could get away with it. But the truth always comes to light." Edith's face crumpled as the weight of her guilt bore down on her. She sank to her knees, her hands clutching at her chest as though she could stop the flood of emotions crashing over her. "I didn't mean to. He ruined my life. He took everything from me." Beatrice watched her closely, her expression unreadable. The storm outside raged on, but inside the storm had passed. The killer had been exposed. As the police arrived shortly thereafter, Beatrice took one last look at the room. The guests who had once been so eager to uncover the truth were now silent, their eyes averted. Beatrice and Arthur stood together, their bond strengthened by the events of the evening. They had solved the mystery, and in doing so had revealed a darker side of human nature. The truth, as it always did, had come to light.